Great. Okay, so welcome to lecture number 5, social media at work. I will continue now. First of all, I hope you enjoyed the meetings last Thursday, and they were very useful for your. I hope they were useful for your group paper. Please remember that this Sunday evening at 12 o'clock is the deadline for the draft of the group paper, and then next week in the work group sessions we will have individual feedback per subgroup on your progress. You don't have to hand in the entire paper, but the more you hand in, the more feedback we can provide. Yeah, so that's the answer to the question. So if you hand in nothing, we don't care. It's just the opportunity for you to receive feedback on your paper. So if you have a complete draft, then we can get feedback on a complete draft. If you have nothing, we get feedback on nothing, but then you have to do it all on your own. So it doesn't matter for us, but the more you can do in the meantime, the better, the more feedback, because the more feedback we can provide. Please remember the deadline is Sunday evening, because we need a couple of days to read through all the papers, of course. Okay, then back to the lecture. Next week we ended halfway in the discussion of virtual teams and the pros and cons of virtual teams, and I discussed a second here. This slide, in which I shortly explained, okay, what are the functions of technology in virtual teams. We discussed that virtual teams can be kind of classified along different dimensions of virtualness or virtuality, and it's not always the case that a virtual team is just people who never meet each other, but a virtual team is the virtuality of a virtual team kind of depends on how often the team meets together, how fluid the team is, how they rely on IT, etc. But in general, virtual teams depend on technology to support their activities. And there are 3 functions of that technology in virtual teams. So first of all, information processing, that is the conveyance, which means giving information, decision making, shared documents, etc. So all those tasks you need to shift information around in the virtual teams. A shared Word document in which you can work, file sharing opportunities, etc. Those kind of things are there to support information. Think your basic Google Doc or your Word on Microsoft 365 with your OneDrive, things like that. So those are the exact same things that you use in organizations. So the second thing that virtual teams, the second role of technology in virtual teams is process structuring, the coordination of the group process. Who does what when, setting tasks, planning agendas, those kinds of things needed for task coordination and agenda setting. Think Outlook calendars, planners, shared to-do lists, those kind of things. And of course, third, what a virtual team needs in terms of technology is communication support. So the ability to communicate. Zoom, what you do now, chat, discussion boards, email, video conferencing, telephone calls, etc. So those are the 3 main functions of technology in virtual teams, and those will return in the coming slides. And if you look at, I think I already said it last week, if you look at the basic functionalities of every technology out there, every enterprise social media system or enterprise workgroup system, whatever, they all support these 3 types of tasks. Well, this is based on a paper from 1998, which was really based on a paper for teams which were really virtual, which only used technology. but I think they are really applicable to how people nowadays use technology in virtual teams as well. Oh, sorry. And if you think of the affordances we talked about in the previous lectures, so the affordances of social media, visibility, persistence, adaptability, associations, and if you look at the characteristics, or actually also affordances of computer-mediated communication, reduced queues, the controllability you have over those queues, the social presence that is there or not, depending on the computer-mediated communication technology you use, and the basic ability to communicate. Then you can see there is a lot of overlap between these affordances and these functions of virtual team technology. And there is a lot you can predict based on this model on this slide. For example, okay, if we in our team we want to support information processing, so we want the team to be able to share important information and documents. Okay, what do we need? Okay, we need visibility, we need persistence, we need editability. Okay, what do we need if we want to support communication support? Okay, then we need to think about the characteristics of computer-mediated communication. Do we want to do that only via chat, or do we also want to have more queues? Do we want to use Zoom or have regular face-to-face meetings? Regular face-to-face meetings help, but maybe we also want like discussion boards, because then you can think a lot longer about what you're going to say in a group. So it gives you controllability again. So I think you can really tie these affordances of computer-mediated communication and social media really nicely through these three functions of technology in virtual teams, and think about, okay, in a specific team, what kind of affordances would I need in order to support the team the best? And of course, there's no clear-cut answer. It really depends on the organization, the type of team. If you have a team that does not know each other beforehand, maybe you want a first face-to-face meeting. So maybe you want to have few reduced queues in your computer-mediated communication. Maybe a team mostly depends on communication support. Okay, then you may not need the information processing capabilities, etc. So how you exactly tie the affordances to the roles of technology and to the functions of to these functions described here really depends on characteristics of the task and the organization, the people, etc. Not what we discussed in the first few lectures. So that was the first main thing I wanted to tell about virtual teams. The second one is, confusingly, a bit earlier on the slides. So if you think about the pros and cons of virtual teams, there are a lot of possible pros and cons of virtual teams. So first, if we look at let's start positively. If we look at the pros of virtual teams, it's they're independent of time and space. It's flexible. You have access to knowledge because if the team is virtual and relies on technology, it's usually persistent. So you have access to everything everyone said at any given point in time. Virtual teams are often cheaper because people don't have to fly halfway across the globe to meet each other. There are also effects of anonymity, of course, so of reduced queues and controllability. People may be more honest, people may be more creative because they feel more anonymous because of the reduced queues. And of course, these three technology functions of virtual teams that help virtual teams in doing their job. So those are several pros of virtual teams. And if you look at each of these advantages of virtual teams, you see that they are really tied again to the affordances of computer-mediated communication and social media. But of course, there are also a lot of disadvantages to virtual teams. So the cons are, it's difficult to establish awareness and trust in virtual teams. imagine that well, you don't have to imagine that you work in a sort of virtual teams in doing the assignment. And if you don't know each other beforehand and you only meet via Zoom or even, without visuals, it may be very difficult to establish trust in virtual teams. So that's one disadvantage. Another disadvantage that's also often pretty difficult to manage the social process. We have that for example, in our organization as well. So of course we spent the last 1.5 years online, and we hardly visited the university. And we met, so we had our regular meetings via Zoom, and sometimes we had like those fun activities via Zoom, bingos, etc. But it's still difficult to manage the social process. When you just sometimes you just have a talk at the coffee machine, or you're dropped by someone's office, and that's where you hear how someone's doing. And that's more difficult in a setting where you meet with the whole group online. And you can, because you can manage it and you can plan meetings, etc. But it's more difficult in virtual teams, of course. Well, the third disadvantage is social loafing and non-participation. Kind of relates to trust and awareness. So it's just easier in virtual teams to loaf, so to not participate in the team, because there's less control. Well, there are communication and coordination issues related to all the previous. So difficult to communicate social information sometimes. Sometimes difficult to coordinate. Research says that virtual teams sometimes may be inefficient because it's difficult to communicate. Well, especially inefficient if you have to do like the difficult emotional stuff, negotiations, etc. There are leadership issues in virtual teams. It's difficult to establish leadership, and if you have a leader who is difficult to be listened to. That's basically what we discussed in the first lecture, that you have two types of leadership. Basically, so one type of leadership is like being like the manager. Okay, you have to do this, and I'm going to check if you do it, and I'm going to check your work. And the other type of leadership is called transformational leadership, and that is more participatory leadership and socially managing a team. Setting end goals and making sure the team is all right, but not managing every micro task. But in general, be like supportive, setting end goals and managing the process and the people instead of the task. It may sound kind of natural that the second type of leadership may be the best type of leadership, but that isn't always the case. And it's also not always the case that leaders behave in such a way. And it turns out that especially the first type of leadership, the transactional type of leadership, is quite difficult to manage in virtual teams, because of course it's difficult to control and check upon your team members. So you really have to be a good transformational leader, like a good social leader, and a good social manager in order to be a leader in the virtual team. What you also often see is that there is really an imbalance if there are different subgroups in a virtual team. And we're now conducting a study within a hospital in which we monitor how physicians, doctors, etc., and surgeons, etc., how they meet. So, and they discuss a couple of times a week. They have a meeting of 1.5 hours or so in which they discuss every patient to which something happened, like new patients after surgery, etc. And that's often partly virtual. So there are people at one hospital, and then people they dial in via video conferencing from another hospital. So you have different kind of subgroups, and even within the people in a certain physical room, you have subgroups, because you have the surgeons and you have the physicians and And it turns out that, so at least in the first groups you observed, you really see the subgroup issues. So especially between the people at different locations. So there is a kind of a barrier in there. So the video conferencing is a kind of a barrier. So you see the people in one group who is physically there talking to each other, and you see the people at the other end of the line talking to each other, but there is less discussion via video conferencing, which I think is very interesting. That is, and that's I think really one of the main disadvantages of virtual teams, is especially when you have like different subgroups who meet face to face and with other groups who they meet virtually. Then that's really difficult to manage. I don't have a solution yet. And finally, in general, in virtual teams, and I think that's the main underlying cause of like all the disadvantages of virtual teams, it's that it's often difficult to create a shared understanding of or common ground. That's what we'll talk about next. But a shared understanding and a / common ground is the basic idea that you are a team and that you want to accomplish a task. So shared understanding is kind of it has a social aspect. Okay, we are the team and we need to do this together. And there is and it has a kind of a task aspect. So okay, we together know what the task will be and who does what. And creating that shared understanding of the team and the task is oftentimes difficult in virtual teams. And that actually, if you can manage that, then basically all the other disadvantages may disappear, because then you have established trust, then everyone will participate, etc. So basically creating the shared understanding is one of the main tasks of virtual teams. One of the main challenges for virtual teams. And if you look at this slide, so the functionality of virtual teams, you see that they are that these three functions of technology, they help support this shared understanding of virtual teams, because a shared understanding is having a sense of like a social sense of the team. Well, you can establish that by communication support. And you need a sense of, okay, who's going to do what, when, and what is the exact task. And that's these functions of virtual teams. So basically these three together help, if you apply them correctly, help create a shared understanding. I'm sorry, so information processing is giving information. Information processing is sharing information in a virtual team. So think about the assignment you're working on now. So you communicate with each other, but you also, you send each other files. You have a shared document in which you type, and that's basically sharing information. So you type a part, you type a part of the paper. Someone else comments. You have a couple of references that you share. So that's information processing. So everything related to the information you need for the task. Process structuring is really the agenda setting part. It's who does what when. So it's not processing that information. It's setting the agenda, coordination, datum triggers, shared agendas. Yeah. Okay. Thanks. good that you ask, because it's kind of confusing. So I almost get confused myself, because then I see information processing and process structuring, and I see 2 times the word process, and then I get confused. But in this case, really, information processing is indeed the information and the processing that information, and process structuring, I think a better name would be like agenda setting or something like that. But or coordination would probably be the best. Well, not sure, but they call it process structuring, and it relates to the agenda setting and coordination. So what is that shared understanding? So shared understanding, common ground. So you have many different words. So in many different areas of research, they have a similar concept. So in communication, in business, in management, in economics, in social science, etc. But it's called differently. So they call it shared understanding, common ground, mental model, team awareness, convergence, and several other words for the same concepts, actually. We don't have to remember them all, of course, but just remember that there are different terms which all kind of capture the same underlying concept. So shared understanding, mental model, awareness, etc. And it basically means reaching a common understanding of the task and each other's viewpoints. So basically it means understanding of the task through sharing information and coordinating. We call that conveyance. And that basically is information processing and process structuring. And to reach shared understanding, you need to understand each other and each other's viewpoints. So you need to have an awareness of, okay, who am I in a team with? And you do that by with communication support. So creating social presence, creating a shared understanding, a shared identity or understanding of who is who in a team. Let me explain after a sip of water. So maybe shortly again. So a shared understanding is reaching a common understanding of both the task and people in a virtual team. Understanding the task is basically information processing and process structuring together. And that's what we call conveyance. So basically dealing with the information and the planning. So the whole information and structural side of a team task. And we need to reach something called convergence, which basically is that you understand who is who in a team and that you can work together as a team. And you can support that by communication in a virtual team. And there are different ways of reaching that convergence, so reaching that second part of shared understanding. So one simple solution is increasing the presence of the interaction, meeting face to face, using Zoom instead of chat, those kinds of things. Because, many studies say, and we've also seen it in the social presence theory, if you increase presence, people will like each other more and will trust each other more. So that's one solution to support communication support. But if you don't have that option, because people can never meet at the same time, or because they don't want to meet, or they cannot meet face-to-face or with video conferencing, or for other reasons, you can also create a shared identity. So that's what we talked about last week when I explained the SIDE model, the social identity model of the innovation effects, which says when people are anonymous, but you have a kind of a shared identity. So we know that we are a virtual team, we know that we are all students at Tilburg University, then people really feel part of that team, and they can also work together well because they feel connected. And another solution may be, understanding what understanding the expertise and the skills of everyone in that team. So even if you don't know or don't like each other, you can also work together if you know, okay, I don't know much about that person, but I know he's an expert in this, so I trust that he can do this part of the job. But of course, you also need to communicate that in a virtual team by sharing LinkedIn pages, for example. And that's what's called. So and that together is basically using the communication capabilities of a virtual team in order to, create social presence or enhance social presence, create a shared identity, communicate who knows what in a virtual team. So that's the whole communication part of a virtual team, and that's called convergence. And together, that conveyance of information, that convergence through communication, that is shared understanding in a virtual team. And this shared understanding is like really one of the main concepts in the virtual team, but also in the general team literature. Finally, and then I'm going to switch to the knowledge management part. If you read the paper by Malhotra and Majchzak, they don't call it that way. But if you basically read the paper and see how they measure and define their concepts, they basically study shared understanding. Because what they say, what they hypothesize, what they also found in that paper, is that if you have a team that has to perform like difficult tasks, non-routine tasks, then you need IT that supports, as they call, task knowledge awareness. But if you look at their definition of task knowledge awareness, I think it's here, that is technology to contribute knowledge to team, keep track of changes, link and compare knowledge, which is exactly similar to information processing and process structuring. So basically they say, if you have to perform non-routine tasks, then you need information processing and process support in order for teams to perform well. Then they say, if you cross a lot of knowledge boundaries, so if the team consists of members of different countries, of members with completely different expertise, then you cross a lot of knowledge boundaries. So there are, so the team is not consists of people who do the same work and are from the same company, but the team consists of people from different expertise, different companies, maybe even different countries. Then they say, if you want to support a team like that, then you need IT to support presence awareness. And again, if you look at the definition of presence awareness, that really is similar to communication support. Because they say presence awareness, then you need technology that affords feeling presence with others, synchronous interaction, flexible communication, which is basically communication support. So that basically means that they say, oh, well, if you have a difficult task, then you need a lot of conveyance technology, information process structuring in order for teams to perform. And if you have a diverse team, then it is best if you have a lot of communication support in your virtual team for them to perform best. So basically this boils down to, again, shared understanding. So in summary, let me go back a couple of slides. The affordances of computer-mediated communication and social media can be tailored in such a way that you can support these three main functions of technology: information processing, process structuring, and communication support. Information processing and process structuring is what we call conveyance. It's communicating information about the task, processing that information, so everything task related. Communication support is mostly about convergence. It's about getting to know each other. It's about discussing. It's about negotiating what the best solution is for a problem. And in order to support that, you need communication support, video conferencing, creating a shared identity, those kinds of things. And that together makes for effective virtual teams. Well, that's basically the main point of this part. So this is the main takeaway of the lecture. So I have an example of a study we did ourselves about virtual teams in 3D environments, but it mainly supports what I said before, that you need shared understanding consisting of conveyance and convergence in order to support a virtual team. So I think I'm going to switch over to knowledge management now, because that's the part I really have to discuss and really want to discuss in the remainder of the lecture. So I love it that you're always intrinsically interested in the in the literature. I don't know. I'm not going to. So you know, the exam is an open book exam. So a question on the exam could be, okay, suppose you want to support a virtual team with augmented reality or something like that, and then explain what types of affordances you need to support that virtual team. So that may well be an exam question. So it may be based on the paper about 3D virtual environments, but you should still be able to answer it because you have learned a lot about affordances and different tasks of virtual teams. So I would read the paper if I were you, but if you think, well, I don't want to prepare the exam, don't read the paper, because you may be able to answer a question like that, you know, with the literature we have now. It's a bit difficult to, you know, with an open book exam like this, it's difficult to say what will be on the exam, because there will be no questions in which we ask a specific detail from a paper, because that's a, you know, that's not going on the exam. So the exam will be online at home, but no, it doesn't necessarily have to be at home. You have to have a computer with an internet connection. So if you're on holiday or on the campus or at home, it's all fine. And it's even so that the exam will be an assignment. So you have a slot of 2.5 hours for the exam. Right before the exam, the assignment will become available. You can download the assignment. It's a Word document. You have to do the exam. You have to make the exam in the Word document, and then after 2.5 hours or earlier, you have to re-upload the assignment. So you have to hand in the assignment. So in the meantime, you don't even need an internet connection. But even if you not have a stable internet connection, you can still do the exam at home. It is, if I remember that I already explained it, but I'm not sure. So let me explain it again. The exam is an open book exam. So maybe I explained it in the workgroup session. So good that you asked. So the exam will be an open book exam, which means that you can use everything you want. So you can keep all papers present. You can hire a whole team of experts to stand behind you and help you with the question, you know, whatever. But it is an open book exam within a specific time frame. So you have, so there is a time slot for the exam, just similar to exams on campus. So a time slot of 2.5 hours. So you have 2.5 hours to do the exam. You do the exam by downloading the assignment. It's a Word document, filling in the Word document, and re-uploading the Word document afterwards. And of course, we check the Word document for plagiarism. So if you work together, we will notice. The exam will not be proctored exactly because what Joost says, everything would be flagged because you are using all documents, etc. Well, experts are not allowed. You have to do the exam alone, and it is impossible for you to communicate with your fellow students in the meantime, or do something else besides doing the exam, because the exam will consist of 3 essay questions. So you have 2.5 hours to write 3 short essays, which is really a tight deadline. So you won't have any time but writing the exam. You don't need to use references in your answer, but you can use citations. Well, I mean citations. So you can say, well, in the paper by this and them, it is argued. So that's okay. So you can refer to a specific paper, but you don't need to include references at the end. So no references. So last year, we also did the exam this way, because of course we had to because of Corona, but we really liked it. And it also turned out that the students really liked it. So everyone was really nervous and everyone said it was a very tough exam, but most of the students also really liked the exam because it was not a simple exam as, what is on page so-and-so, or name the 3 blah, blah, but it was really an exam which was on a, master level or higher. The passing rate of the exam, I think it was about 20% or so. Joost? No, I'm kidding, of course. No, it was 80% or so. No, I think it was about 80%. So maybe in total it was, I think we had, I think after the exam and the re-exam, it was almost 90%, no, 90% who passed the course. Oh, there is there is no such thing as a 5.5 in the way we count grades. There has never been in the in any course that you took, if everything is correct, because we always have to round a 5.5 to a 6. So if you have a 5.4 for the exam, you have a 5. If you have a 5.4999999, you have a 5. If you have a 5.5 or higher, well, higher than until a 6, of course, you have a 6. So there's no such thing as a 5.5, but there is such thing as a 6 or a 5. You cannot compensate. No compensation. So you have to pass both the exam and the paper and the assignment you already did in order to pass the course as a whole. Yeah, it's too bad, but it has a reason, of course. So we have certain goals with our course. So we have certain learning objectives. So we want you to be able to, learn how to write a paper, and we want you to discuss and analyze the course contents and the literature. So if you could compensate, you could just do one half of the course and the other half not. So you need to be able to do everything. So you cannot compensate, no. But still, don't worry too much about the exam. And I think in the last lecture, Joost will explain a bit more about the exam, and we may give some examples of the types of questions you can expect. But the question I asked, I mentioned before, so I'm now not going to explain the last paper about virtual environments, but I can still say, well, if you think of virtual environments in which people are immersed in a virtual environment, such as Minecraft or whatever, explain using the concept of so explain which types of affordances this environment has, and explain how these affordances may support virtual teams. So that I think, well, maybe I even do a question like that in the exam. So that's a that would be the type of questions you can expect in the exam. And you don't have to remember what the affordances are, but it's really, we really advise you to, study the content of the lectures and the slides, etc., because there's no time in those 2.5 hours to start reading literature. So you do have to know what affordances are. It really helps to know what the 4 affordances are. It helps to know what a virtual team is, because if you have to look everything up at the exam, you won't have time to finish the exam. So basically, still important to prepare for the exam. Okay, thanks. It's good that you, for everyone, thanks for asking about the questions of the exam, and if you need to know the papers, because that really, we did not yet explain what the exam will be about, and it's good to know, I think, at this point. So thanks. Any other questions? Then feel free to post them in the chat, but in the meantime, I'll have a short start with the knowledge management lecture before the break. So thanks, everyone. So I'm going to talk a bit about knowledge management and a bit about the challenges of managing a virtual team. And then I want to switch to the possible solutions of managing knowledge in a virtual team, because I think they are quite interesting for all types of virtual teams. So before the break, let me shortly explain what knowledge management is and why it's important. Well, we already discussed, I think, in the first lecture, that if you look at the type of job we do and the type of job you will end up doing, knowledge is you all basically handle information and knowledge. You don't, most of you will not actually make physical stuff, but you deal with information. So knowledge is basically the most important production factor for us, but also in the economy as a whole. And the most valued companies in the world are really knowledge organizations. Apple, banks, insurance companies, Facebook. They all have products which mainly relate to information, even Apple. But managing knowledge is really a serious and difficult issue, because organizations are increasingly flexible. They work together across the globe. They have to work together with other organizations. There's an increased need to process information, to keep in touch with everything that happens in and outside the organization. So it's very difficult to manage all that information and to manage people who have to deal with that information and who have to do something with that information. So knowledge management is really difficult. What makes it more difficult is that you have different types of knowledge. So there is a thing called explicit knowledge, which is knowledge that can be codified, stored, transmitted, which is basically simple knowledge. So if I say to you, the exam will be on October 18th between 10 and 12, I don't know when the exam is, that's explicit knowledge. I can say that, I can post that on Canvas, and it can be stored, etc. Similarly to the slides of this lecture. It's explicit knowledge, that it's on the slide, period. But you also have knowledge that is implicit. It's also called tacit, zwijgend in Dutch, so tacit knowledge. And that is knowledge that is difficult to communicate, because we often don't know who knows what. And we may not even realize we know something. So tacit knowledge is knowledge based on experience, on collaboration, commitment, and competence, basically because you are part of an organization and a team. Think things like, okay, I know that he is better in this part of the process of writing a paper, and then that person is better in another part of the process. If I have a problem with my computer, I know where to go in the organization. So I will not go through the official channels, but I know that there's someone who will help me. Or people knowing, okay, I have contacts outside the organization. If there's a certain issue, I can go to that person. So basically, there is a lot of knowledge in an organization that is really not written down somewhere. That's not in a database or in a Word document, but that just resides in the minds of people. And that knowledge, that is really difficult to, to codify. So that explicit knowledge, that lives in people's minds. It consists of mental models of values, of your perceptions, of the information you have implicitly. So you don't know that you know it. So it's really difficult to store and transfer. And that information requires communication and collaboration and understanding. And again, this relates to what we just said. So explicit knowledge can be managed by information processing and process structuring. Okay, you can have databases and shared Word documents, etc., in which you write stuff down. But implicit knowledge really requires communication support. It requires a mental model. It requires the communication between team members in order to share the tacit knowledge. And if you look at the affordances of social media, visibility, persistence, editability, associations, they are really tied to that tacit knowledge components of knowledge management. And this is one of the main reasons that social media systems are used in organizations, because many organizations hope that social media can be used to manage that tacit knowledge. So if you think of social media systems in organizations, you have discussion boards, you have profile pages, similar to your LinkedIn and Facebook page, in which you can update your status, etc. You can create associations between people. People can react on what you post online. So I hope you can really imagine that all those affordances of social media can really be used for to manage implicit and tacit knowledge. You're absolutely right. Sharing a picture posted is explicit knowledge. Yeah, you're absolutely right. So organizations hope that with social media, because you can share a picture, people can react, you have a list of the people you know, organizations hope that with that social media, you can make all that implicit knowledge more explicit. So thanks. That's something I should really have mentioned, yes. So organizations really rely on social media to manage knowledge management, especially to manage tacit knowledge. And because social media is persistent, it becomes more explicit, especially if it's searchable, etc. So absolutely right. So and that's one of the main reasons that many organizations implement things like Office 365 and Slack and any other social media tool, because they hope to make what is inside people's minds more explicit to others. So by using explicit knowledge, posting, well, no, it's not using explicit knowledge. It's making implicit knowledge explicit. So, for example, if someone asks let's say, if someone asks a question, so if you post a question in this chat, so you have a certain issue, then normally you would not know who to ask. Let's say you work in an organization with 1,000 people. You would not know. Okay, I don't know. I don't know who I can go to get this question answered. But I may have the answer to your question. But it's implicit knowledge, because I don't know that you have the question and you don't know that I have the answer. So the knowledge is implicit. But if you post your question online and I see the question and I answer, then we have made that implicit knowledge. I know the answer to your question. We have made that implicit. So you you make implicit knowledge explicit with social media. Does that answer your question, Lee? Okay, yeah, thanks. And you can imagine that happening a lot, you know. So I am pretty sure that in your Facebook or Instagram feed, you've come across a question of someone, you know, someone who asks, oh, can anyone help me find a room in Dilburg, for example, or can anyone help me with this and that? And then someone replying, oh, I may have some opportunity for you. That's the exact same process, you know, that someone using the affordances of social media to post a general question to a wide audience, and then someone knowing the answer of someone being able to help further, and they and they giving the answer, thereby making their implicit knowledge explicit. So think about those kind of situations. Now, explicit knowledge is not asking a question. So if I post on Canvas, the exam will be next week. That's explicit knowledge. If you go to Wikipedia and to find a paper on, to find an article on Wikipedia about explicit knowledge, that's explicit knowledge. If you read a book, that's explicit knowledge. So basically, everything that is stored and codified and is easily transmitted. You know, if you start working in an organization and there is a manual for a certain system, that is explicit knowledge. But knowing who to go to when that system breaks down, that is implicit knowledge, because that's not in the manual. So what you've done now is basically, so you've asked so I did not know beforehand that you had this question. So it was kind of implicit. You also, well, you could expect that I knew the answer, but I didn't give the answer to your question. But now we discussed about what explicit and implicit knowledge is, and now your question is on the chat, and my question is recorded. So now we've made it more explicit. So basically, all information that is written down and codified is what we call explicit knowledge. Everything that is not codified and written down is called implicit. And the goal of social media is to make that implicit knowledge more explicit. So have ways for people to communicate and share information with each other. If I were to ask a question in class without reporting, that would have been implicit knowledge. Yeah, especially, say, for example, if you come to me after class and ask me a question and I answer your question, then that knowledge remains implicit. So we have shared it, but maybe other people have that question as well. Maybe it's a question that's relevant for the whole group. So now we both have that knowledge, but it's still not out there. So it's still implicit, yes. And even still, so it's not a matter, of course, of implicit, explicit. So this lecture is recorded, but it's not searchable. So you still have to, know that a question was answered in the lecture and at a certain time point. So we've made it more explicit, but it's not completely clear and searchable for everyone. So that implicit and explicit is, I now discuss it a bit like it's black and white, but of course it's more of a dimension, of course. So you have knowledge that is really easily findable and searchable. You have knowledge that really is only in someone's mind, and you have a lot of in between, of course. Thanks, Merel. Thanks, Saskia. Good questions. That was a lot. So shall we go have a break for 10 minutes and then continue? So let's continue at 10 before 10 to 10. Yes. Okay, I'm gonna get some coffee. I'll see you in a bit. And if you have questions on the exam or on knowledge management or whatever, feel free to post them now in the chat. Got to stop the recording for a moment, so there is a sorry for the 5 minutes of nothing. So let's continue. So we talked about explicit and implicit knowledge, and so if you, I'll think about, well, no. So you can imagine that in normal organizations, or in normal teams and normal organizations who don't work or who don't work that much virtually, or in virtual teams, this is already difficult. It's already difficult to manage implicit knowledge and to make sure that everyone knows everything that they need to know in an organization. And you can imagine that in a virtual team, this is even more difficult because people work independent of place time, may even work for different organizations, etc. So that's why organizations also use social media in order to manage knowledge if people work in more or less virtual teams. So if you think of all the tasks with managing a virtual team and managing knowledge, you can see, it starts out pretty simple. Sharing explicit information is relatively easy. Making implicit knowledge explicit, who knows what, expertise, the examples we talked about before the break, that is already a bit more difficult. But managing explicit knowledge in like the next level, so making sure that everyone, so for example, if you have to do a task in a virtual team, making sure that everyone has the same idea of the task, that everyone knows what the task is, that you have a kind of a shared idea of how to approach a task. For example, in your group, are you a team who really wants to go for it, go for the maximum, highest grade possible, or do you think, okay, a 6 is also fine? So that's something that has to do with a shared mental model, what kind of team are we? You can imagine that is even more difficult in virtual teams to manage. And then managing the social process, creating a common bond, the attitude toward participating in a virtual team, towards sharing knowledge, etc. So that is maybe the most difficult to manage. So if you look at knowledge sharing in a virtual teams and knowledge sharing in modern organizations which work virtually for a lot of the time, then you see that there are a lot of challenges in sharing that knowledge. Now, we talked already about most of them, because before the break we talked about, okay, how can you create a shared mental model, a shared understanding? How can you create a common bond in a virtual team? So we've already had some suggestions on how to do this, how to manage these difficult parts of knowledge management in virtual teams. And I also want to go back for a minute to the first and second lecture, in which we discussed network individualism. That knowledge management is a challenge in modern organizations. It's really tied to organizations becoming more and more individualized, so more and more so more and more like person-to-person, weak tie networks, etc. And that's what you see happening in organizations. So people come in an organization for a project and then leave. Consultants are hired. People don't remain working in an organization forever, but they switch organizations quite rapidly. After a few years, it's time for something new. And you can imagine that makes knowledge management even more difficult, because I learn a lot of things in my organization. I learn how to handle a lot of issues the organization deals with. And then in a couple of years, I leave. But the organization really wants to keep me, or not me, but the organization wants to keep my knowledge and my expertise within the organization. So they really have a great incentive to, make everything that I know, make all my implicit knowledge explicit before I leave the organization. And that's also why they have those knowledge management systems and enterprise social media systems. So you can imagine that, especially if in organizations who work a bit network individualized, so with larger teams, people from outside of the organization joining, working with a lot of freelancers, etc., then those organizations really have it even more difficult in managing knowledge sharing in organizations. Tanya, did I already answer your question or not? I'm not sure. So, and I want to tie the discussion of organizations in. Okay, thank you. I want to tie this network individual organizations to 3 types of virtual teams. So if you look at how organizations organize themselves, and especially how teams organize themselves, it's not always in terms of virtual teams, but also in terms of communities and networks of practice. So a virtual team we discussed before. So it's usually a small group of people working on a common task, but mediated by technology and not necessarily constrained by time and place. But in organizations, people oftentimes also work together in more loose types of teams, which we call communities of practice. So those are communities of practice are groups of people who work together on a shared practice, let's say on a larger common task. So imagine, like the example here, imagine designing or developing a new airplane, or imagine designing a building, a new skyscraper, for example. That's a lot of people involved, but it's still a group usually who works together on the same task, on the same task. Okay, we have to build a new airplane or design a new airplane, who is usually tightly knit, or at least a bit tightly knit. So okay, they know that they are a team and they are oftentimes part of the same organization, or at least they have the same same goal. And a team like that, a design team, for example, has usually a quite strong interpersonal ties, not as tightly as maybe a virtual team or an offline team has, but they usually know each other. So so a community of practice is usually a larger virtual team, maybe different types of organizations, but usually they know each other and they work on the same task. So they have quite strong interpersonal ties. They don't have to be friends, but they know each other. Bond over identity, that means that they don't necessarily share a common identity. So we feel part of this in this group, but they do feel a certain bond. Okay, we work on this same task and I know the people who I work with. So that is a bond that you create. I'll explain that a bit more later on. They typically work face-to-face. That was the original definition, but that's no longer the case as many teams go virtual now, but they can work face-to-face, or at least in the same building. Think of a large group of people who work for Boeing or Airbus who develop a new plane. So you have different sub-teams who develop each part of the plane, but they usually know each other. They may work in the same building, or at least for the same organization, and they have a similar goal. So that's a community of practice. And for many larger projects in organizations, you see a virtual team like this. So not a tight-knit group of people, but a bit of a larger group. What distinguishes a task from a larger task? Yeah, well, it's not, yeah, that's a very good question. I don't think there's a clear-cut distinction between a task and a larger task. So there is if you, as a complete design team for Boeing, which consists of hundreds of people, design a new airplane, that's a larger task. The paper you write here for this course is a smaller task, and then you have everything in between. So it kind of depends. So you usually have, so for example, if you work at a digital marketing agency, you have a smaller team who is responsible for developing a campaign for a certain client, and that's still a smaller task. And if you have a larger task, say, well, we have to think of a new strategy for an organization or develop a whole new financial product, that there are a lot more people involved in doing that, and that makes it a community of practice, because you have a more diverse and larger group of people involved. But it's not always clear cut, of course. You also see that people organize themselves more and more in things that we call networks of practice. And if you are a member of the FIFA forum and an active member of the FIFA forum, or if you are a programmer and if you are on Stack Overflow or GitHub or whatever, then you are part of a network of practice. Because a network of practice is a large group of people who are really dispersed across organizations and across the globe, perhaps. So they are really loosely knit, and they usually don't know each other, so they have very weak interpersonal bonds. But what they do have is they share a certain identity. So we are part of the FIFA forum, we are all programmers and a part of Stack Overflow. And basically every discussion forum you can find is a kind of a network of practice. So they share a certain identity, so they feel part of the same group, and they have a shared practice. So they are all programmers, for example. Yeah, so Facebook groups can also be considered networks of practice. So for example, if you are if you are an avid member of a curly girl method, I have no clue what that means, then and you participate in that Facebook group, and you can ask questions and you answer other people's questions, or you just just lurk, then you're part of that network of practice. Yeah. And loosely knit and weak interpersonal bonds really goes together. So it's weak interpersonal ties. And what is before strong interpersonal ties relates to the strong and weak ties. I think we talked about in the previous lecture. So the strong ties are the people you know well, your friends, your colleagues, etc. And weak ties is the rest of the network. So your acquaintances, the colleagues you don't know so well. But also members of a network of practice. Yeah. But it's kind of, and your weak ties are by definition also loosely knit. But the interesting thing is, especially from an organizational perspective, that if you look at these communities, if you look at GitHub, if you look at Stack Overflow, both for programmers, if you look at even the backpacker Facebook curly girl method Facebook group, you see that there are a lot of people there who really feel part of that group, and people helping each other. So if someone has a question, there are a lot of people trying to help. And this is really weird, because with everything that you learned, with many things that you've learned and many solutions you give, for example, in the first presentation to how virtual teams behave, you are not able to explain this. So this is a virtual team of people who don't know each other. They're very anonymous, so social presence is really low. But they still help each other. They still have a shared identity, and they're still very willing to help each other out. So what explains this? And this is kind of the holy grail for organizations as well, because organizations observe that there are people who willingly and freely, without financial or any other compensation, help each other out. And organizations think, well, why don't we have that in our organization? If we would have that, we would be able to, share knowledge and participate way better than we do now. So there has been a lot of research which has focused on these networks of practice and which tries to explain why they are successful. And they really inform also organizations with, the use of social media and in supporting virtual teams and supporting knowledge management in general. Because again, these teams are pretty interesting because they have a shared identity, but they are very non-socially present, very anonymous. They don't know each other. So why do they share? And there are a couple of answers that I want to explain. So basically, we have seen that knowledge management is very difficult because you have explicit knowledge, which is relatively easy to communicate, but you also have implicit knowledge and other challenges in organizations which hamper people to participate in the organization. So basically this slide. So basically as an organization, you want your people to do all of this. So you want them to share explicit knowledge, you want them to make implicit knowledge explicit, by updating their internal Facebook page, by sharing every problem they encountered task-wise on a discussion board, whatever. But you also want them to create a kind of a mental model of what they need to do in the organization, and you also want them to get along. So as an organization, you want to accomplish all of this. But as organizations become more virtual and rely more and more on communication technology and on social media for people in the organization to work together, this becomes more and more difficult. So specifically, if you look at the different types of groups in organizations, you have these issues with all of these types of virtual teams. So with virtual teams, communities of practice, and networks of practice. So the question is, what can we do? How can we support all these different types of teams or the ways of organizing an organization, so that people are willing to work together and are willing to so that they are willing to participate, what you want people to do in the virtual teams, and they are willing to share what they know in a virtual team. And there are different solutions. So I want to, in the remainder of the lecture, talk about 3 different solutions. So first of all, the first solution is technology. This is what we talked about in many lectures before. If you look at social media and computer-mediated communication, they have, because the last slide is confusing still. So if you look at the affordances of computer-mediated communication and the affordances of social media, you can try to implement these affordances in such a way that you can support knowledge sharing. So for example, if you have a enterprise social media system in your organization, you can create associations between people, you can make information more persistent, you can support the social process in a virtual team by implementing video conferencing, so increasing the social presence, etc. So there are many technical solutions, with different systems, with different affordances that can support knowledge sharing. And this is from I forgot the authors of the paper, but this is one of the papers in the literature for today, which have studied if the affordances for social media can actually enhance knowledge management in an organization, or knowledge sharing in an organization, and if that leads to increase performance. And if you look at what they found, so it's not really interesting to Sun at all. Yeah, don't worry. Thanks, Fenna. So if you look at how they, if you look at what they exactly find, so the exact correlations between this, that is not that interesting. I think it's most interesting to see the general picture of the paper. So what they find is that if people feel that they have the ability to create a network in the organization, that what they say is visible, that what they say is persistent, or what everyone says in the organization is persistent and editable, then they say it really allows us to, provide as well as acquire knowledge, and that helps us in our performance. So if you look at how they measured it, they say, well, if I can connect with others, if the social media allows me to see what people have, what questions people have, what type of content they share, etc. If social media allows me to find information, if it allows me to edit or comment on information, then I am able to share knowledge. And of course, this paper has a lot of drawbacks because it's all based on perception of people and not on actual use or actual affordance of social media, but only perceptions. But still, they find that, okay, if you are able as an organization to support knowledge management with the affordance of social media, that would help people in sharing, acquiring knowledge, and in their performance. So I thought it was a pretty interesting paper because it was one of the first who actually linked specific affordances to knowledge management. So you see that if you're able to implement these affordances, then so if you're able to implement these affordances, then people may be able to share knowledge in your organization better. And again, this relates to what we discussed before the break. This really relates to the capabilities of virtual teams. So if you're able to, process information, if you're able to structure, to coordinate, and if you're able to communicate, you will create a shared understanding in a virtual team, and people will be able and willing to communicate and to share what they know. So basically, supporting knowledge management in an organization is basically the same as supporting shared understanding in a virtual team. And I'm not going into detail in all these cases, but they're all clickable. So these are 3 cases of organizations that use social media specifically for these 3 processes. So, for example, Shell, they have a huge corporate Wikipedia page, a huge corporate database of well, it's basically a corporate wiki. Then it's a really big wiki page. And everyone at Shell who has to find an answer to a certain question or who has encountered a new problem updates a wiki page or adds a new page, etc. So they really use social media. If we consider wiki to be social media, they really use social media for information processing, for people to share information, to be able to find information, etc. So they really focus on the information processing part. The case by IBM is that they had a lot of virtual teams dispersed across the globe, but they need to be able to work together on a certain task, design a certain computer chip, so their community should practice. And they use their internal social media system mostly for coordination. So you're a virtual team, this is your shared agenda, this is your shared discussion board. Use it to coordinate your tasks. So they really use enterprise social media for the agenda setting coordination part. BASF, the German chemistry company, they use social media mostly for communication. they said, well, we are a very dispersed organization with many different departments, many different subdivisions, people also working at many different locations across the globe. But we really want to create a kind of a shared sense of working at BASF, I don't know how you pronounce it, as an organization. So what they did was they really created a kind of a corporate Facebook, people being able to have friendly conversations, create subgroups, create their own profile page in order to support the more social aspects of the organization and the teams in the organization. So these cases, I think, are quite interesting because, well, of course, you can do everything with the social media, but those three really chose specifically for a certain type of technology support with their internal social media. So they all used social. So these are all examples of using the technology in such a way to support knowledge management, and this is what we've been discussing like the past 4 lectures. Okay, you can increase presence, you can use social media to increase visibility, to be able to edit each other's comments, etc. So those are all like technical ways in which you can support knowledge sharing. So that's one. But the whole technology thing is only one part of getting people so far as to share knowledge, because you can have all the technology in the world, but if people don't trust each other and if people don't know each other, they won't participate. So a second solution for all the knowledge management challenges is social capital. Well, what is social capital? Well, social capital is the benefits you derive from your social network. So basically, what can you use your friends and family and your acquaintances for? Sounds very egocentric, but of course, the benefits you get from your social network, you also give. And it basically means, okay, what can I get from my social network? If I feel sad, is there someone I can go to for emotional support? Is there a shoulder to cry on? If I need help with my homework, with the exam, who can I go to? If I have a very general question, who can I ask? Can I ask it on Instagram? Who can I borrow money from? Well, basically all the emotional and social and physical, regarding stuff benefits you get from your social network is your social capital. And you derive that social capital from your strong ties, your friends, your good friends and family, the best colleagues you have, and your weak ties, everyone else you know. And you can imagine that this is also pretty important in organizations, of course. So you have your social capital in organizations, you have your colleagues inside and outside of the organization. And if you can enhance that social capital, people will be more willing to work with each other. They will be more willing to share knowledge with each other. So what you want to do as an organization is kind of increase that social capital. So see if you can create connections between people. And there are 3 types of social capital. And in the paper by Vasco and Farai, remember them, they explain those 3 types of social capital, and they explain individual motivations for knowledge sharing. In that paper, they have several definitions and several operationalizations for social capital, for those 3 types of social capital. Pretty interesting to read, but I think it's more interesting to at least know what these types of social capital are and that they contribute to knowledge contribution in organizations. So let me explain first what these 3 types are and then why they are important. So we start with structural capital. So structural capital basically is the people you know. It's it's your network, your connections. So basically, all my colleagues I know at Tilburg University, the colleagues I know at other universities, etc. That is my structural social capital. So simply the list of people in my LinkedIn network is my structural social capital professionally. Cognitive social capital means that you understand each other. I can have a very good colleague in China in my network, but if I only speak Dutch and he only speaks Chinese, we have no cognitive social capital. We cannot understand each other. So we have no cognitive social capital. So that's an extreme example, but also, say that I have a very specific question about statistics, and I ask that to someone who knows a lot of statistics, and that person starts, throwing around different difficult words. Then we also have low cognitive capital. So we simply come from a very different field, and we have not much common ground. And that is cognitive social capital. And then finally, so relational social capital is that you like each other. And together, so you like each other, can get along with each other, feel connected with each other, those kinds of things. And together, these three allow knowledge contribution. Colleague. It doesn't have to be all three, but it really helps if it is all three. So structural social capital is really necessary because that is the people you know, that is really your network. And then someone can be a colleague that you can understand and that can explain things in a way that you can understand. And it can be a colleague that you like. And if it's all three, that's great. But if it's only cognitive and you don't really like him, it can also work. But if you have all three forms of social capital, that works best. And that's pretty obvious, of course. So if a fellow student that you know asks you a question, you can answer that question. But if you don't like that, you are way less inclined to help out that student than if you do like your fellow students. So in general, you want all three, but not necessarily always to the same extent. So basically it boils down to, you know people, you understand people, and you can get along with people. And if you have all three, then you have social capital, a high degree of social capital, and that relates to knowledge contribution. And then I'm going to skip this because in their specific study, they found that relational capital didn't really add to knowledge contribution. But there have been a lot of different papers ever since, which basically confirm that you need all three of them in order to have the best chance of people actually be willing to share knowledge in an organization. So they did not find that every aspect mattered in their study, but the thousands of studies afterwards confirmed all three or different aspects of social capital. But the most important thing is to remember that social capital matters. And well, I'm not sure if I have a slide for that. No. And if you think of social media, so if you think of what social media can do and what computer-mediated communication can do, so if you think of before the break and the previous lecture, you can see all kinds of connections between social capital and social media. Because structural social capital, that's the definition of the affordance of association of social media. So it's the association is the ability to create and manage connections. So that basically is structural social capital. Cognitive social capital is that you understand each other and that you know what the other person knows, so that you can ask a specific person specific questions. Well, that is visibility of social media. and also I think persistence and editability. So you can create a personal profile page. You can search what that person contributed before, and other kinds of things. So those affordances of social media really tie very well to social capital. So with social media, you can increase structural and cognitive social capital. And with computer-mediated communication, by selectively or strategically saying, well, okay, we need face-to-face interaction, we have to create a shared identity, so we need rich forms of communication or not, you can create relational social capital so that people get to know and like each other. So you can, for example, build relationships or build trust. So all the affordances of social media and computer-mediated communication really tie in quite well to these three forms of social capital. So increasing social capital is very important for people being able to work together and contribute knowledge in an organization. And the affordances of social media are really connected to the three forms of social capital. So basically we have technology solutions. But we can also try to increase social capital to get people to work together. But we can stimulate social capital again with social media and computer-mediated communication. Finally, and I'm sorry, I think I need 10 more minutes. So I understand if you have to leave. But I'll keep the recording going, of course, so you can view this at a later time. But it's also great if you can tag along. So I'm sorry, I'll be done at 10:40 or maybe 10:45. So the final solution is what is called common bond, common identity. And this is related to the whole shared understanding part of virtual teams. So this is creating a sense of unity in an organization or in a virtual team or in a community or network of practice. And this is what you see happening in those communities of practice and in those networks of practice. And these are, and this you can also take in your organization and use in your organization. So what is common bond and common identity? Well, a common bond means that you like other people because you know them. So it's officially called attachment through interpersonal bonds. So think of a close group of friends. You like them because you know them. Think of your colleagues, you work with them and which you like them because you know them. So you know each other, you can share personal information with each other, and talk about something else than task-related information, which we call self-disclosure. You feel similar if you feel similar because you know the people. I know Alex and he also likes girly girl, whatever. So you can. So you know what everyone else knows, and you can compare each other. So you can compare the members of your team. Okay, he knows more about this, I know more about that, so we can work together. So basically, you create a sense of community. You create a common. So you create shared understanding. You create attachment because you all know each other. I think this sounds pretty obvious, I'd say. But there's also another way for people to feel connected to each other, and that's common identity. So that is because you feel part of the same group. So you feel part of, well, say you are an avid World of Warcraft player or something like that. So you feel part of the group of people who play the same game. Or if you are a member of a very specific discussion forum on Facebook, you feel connected to the people because you have a shared identity, which is the topic of the discussion forum. And this is a common identity. So you don't necessarily have to know the people you communicate with, but you still feel a connection because you classify each other into a group. You say, they all play World of Warcraft. They all are part of this discussion forum. I don't know who they are, but I know I like them because they all share the same interest or same hobby. So identity is based on group categorization. We are part of the same group. And you have information not about the individual people, but about the group as a whole. Homogeneity means that you see each other as kind of similar because you feel part of the same group. So people, if they think they are part of the same group, they think they are alike. It also basically means that there's a lot of intergroup competition with these kinds of identities. So if you feel part of a specific group, there are almost always groups that you don't feel connected to, which kind of creates a kind of a competition of us versus them. And you are familiar with a group instead of familiar with the people in a group. So again, the identity. So for example, if you have like Apple or Amstel Beer or Wikipedia and maybe a bit of World of Warcraft. So if you're really an Apple fanboy or girl, you don't know, good question. You don't know everyone who uses Apple, but you feel part of the wider Apple community. You feel part of the group. Similar to using, or if you're a Wikipedia editor, so if you add to Wikipedia, you may not even know other people who do the same kind of job, but you feel connected because you feel part of that community. Facebook, for example, is more about common bonds. It's more about, okay, these are the people in my network, and I know these people because I know them individually. World of Warcraft is the answer to the question by Didi is both. If you play World of Warcraft or another multiplayer game, you really feel part of the group of players, so you have a shared identity. But within World of Warcraft, you have your own party. So you have the group of people you play with. So you have both a shared identity with World of Warcraft and with your group of people you play with, but you also know them individually. You may not know their real selves, but you know them individually within World of Warcraft. So you know someone is a dwarf or a half-elf with a certain name, so with a certain identity. So World of Warcraft is basically both common bonds and common identity. Yeah, so you can have both. And this is really interesting because the last two papers for this lecture are two studies which investigate the effectiveness of common bond and common identity groups on knowledge sharing and participation in those groups. And they, especially the first, they investigate networks of practice. So the first paper is about a movie community in which they manipulated what people could actually see in that movie community. And they manipulated, on the one hand, that people, so one half of the people saw only common identity features of the movie community. So they saw a group name, group icon, detailed information about the group, a clustering algorithm that showed group preferences, etc. The other half of the people saw only bond-based aspects of the community. So they had an individual profile-based page. They had individual information about the members of the community. They had no group classification of movies, but individual classification. So if you that person likes this movie, so you like this movie as well. So all kinds of interpersonal comparisons instead of group comparisons. And you had a control group as well, by the way. And what they found is that if you compare it to the control group, who had no common features, you see that common identity and common bond really worked well in terms of attachment to the movie group, the visit frequency, post views, but also posting behavior, so knowledge sharing. So, which basically means you have a group of people who don't know each other, but if you're able to structure such a website in this case in such a way that you create a common identity or a common bond, you see that people are much more willing to participate and to share knowledge. And amazingly, what they found was that common identity worked better. So if you see here that this is significantly different, this is significant, it's basically all significantly different. So common identity worked better than common bond. So people are more willing to share if they feel part of the group than when they simply know the individual members in the group. And that's what the final paper also found. So they had a kind of a game that people played, in which they either had played individually or they played as a team stapler, or they played as individuals. Sorry, this is the team part. They played as a team against other teams, or they played as a team but against each other in the team. So this is no identity. This is common bond. So you play in a team with people, and this is common identity. You play against other teams, and this is a combination of both. And if you then look at the results, this is called the attrition. So this is how long people played the game. You see that if you played the game alone, then people quit fairly quickly. But if you had a kind of a bond, that worked really well. But it worked better if you have the between is the common identity bond. So if you work together as a team against other teams, then people were more likely to continue playing the game. But all kinds of different results, but basically what this means is that you can enhance both. You can enhance a group and enhance knowledge sharing in a group, both by common bond and common identity. But common identity works better in general than common bond, but both are okay. And this is the reason. What if you play against other teams as a team, but individually have to gain points individually? Yeah, that is this condition, the within between condition. So you play against other teams, but also individually. So the within between condition is this one, the dark gray, and that worked second best. So a bit less than the against other teams alone. Sure. So you see here team stapler, so you don't have an individual score, but you only see that you have to play against other teams. And here you are a part of a team, but you see, okay, this is the people I play with or against. And this is just individual play. So it's quite interesting to see that, so this is the reason that those networks of practice are successful. So this is the reason why people are willing to share knowledge and help other people out, even if they don't know each other. It's because people feel connected to other people, and they feel connected because they feel part of the same group, or because they know the people in their group. So for networks of practice, it means that people feel part of the group, so they have a shared identity, and mostly for communities of practice in which all the people know each other, it's because they have a common bond. Can I go to another slide, quick? Okay. So in conclusion, 2 slides with a wrap up. So there are 3 functions of technology in virtual teams. So information processing, process structuring, communication support. The first 2 are called conveyance, the last one convergence. But if you have all three of them, this leads to a shared understanding. So a common idea that you in a group have to do a kind of a task, and that you all know each other and are willing to do the task. So that is shared understanding. The affordances of social media and communication technology allow, or if you don't implement them well, prevent these functions and thus affect shared understanding. So if you look at social media, they mostly affect information processing and process structuring. So visibility allows you to, and editability allows you to present information and share knowledge, etc. It allows you to share connections or to create connections between people. So it mostly allows information processing and process structuring. Computer-mediated communication affordances, social presence, anonymity, those kind of things, they allow convergence. So they allow the people to feel connected to each other. And we've now seen you can either do that by increasing social presence, meeting face-to-face, having Zoom meetings with video conferencing, etc. So that's one way to stimulate convergence, because then people create a common bond. But you can also be strategic in the anonymity. So if people are relatively anonymous, but they feel part of Team Stapler, then people create a shared identity, and then they also are willing to work together. And this is quite interesting, because there are like two different pathways to a successful virtual team and successful knowledge management. One through the social presence route, with video conferencing, face-to-face meetings, so getting people to know each other, common bond, and one through the anonymity route. So being relatively anonymous, but creating a shared identity. And that may be beneficial if you have a group of people who will never meet, or who is across the globe and across different time zones. Then you can be more anonymous and try to create a shared identity. And of course, this all interacts with characteristics of the organization and with the task and the team, etc., in explaining the success. If you have a certain team or a certain task that know each other well, that don't know each other beforehand, an organization which is really competitive, or where people don't trust each other, then these affordances may work better or worse. So finally, for here, what I think is pretty interesting, that there is a kind of an interplay again between the social aspects of a virtual team and people working in an organization, and the technical aspects. So social capital, common bond, and common identity are very important social tools, maybe, to stimulate people to work together in an organization. And they can be helped, and so you can use social media to support these social processes as well, and they interact with each other. So I think that's pretty interesting, that again you see that there's a social interaction between technology affordances and the social aspects, and together they allow a team to work together, or allow people to share knowledge with each other. So that's it for me and for today. So next week Joost will take over, and Thursday and Friday we'll have a workgroup session. You don't have to prepare anything, but I will post some information on Canvas today. And don't forget to hand in your draft paper this Sunday. So for now, thanks for sticking around, and I'll see you this Thursday or Friday. Okay, thank you.